Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today it is finally time to continue on with my year-end 2021 wrap-up videos. I have already done one on my list, which was talking about my 2021 reading stats and looking back at the goals I had at the beginning of the year and whether or not I accomplished them. And that video will be left linked down below and up there, and I will also leave the playlist link down below that at some point will hold all of my 2021 year-end videos. Currently, as I am filming and uploading this, obviously it's just that one video, but at some point it will hold a total of 4 videos, if I remember correctly. So once all the videos are done, the 4 videos in the playlist will be my stats and goals, as I just mentioned. Then this video, which is my best books of 2021. Then I also have my worst books of 2021 / biggest disappointments. And I will have my favorite rereads and favorite series, which I'm just gonna merge into one video to not have to film 4 videos. Also, I don't have above 10 for either of those last 2 categories, so I think I'm gonna be fine. But anyway, usually I start with my worst reads because I like to start with negativity. I didn't vibe with that for some reason, so I asked Twitter which video I should start with this year, and you all said my best reads, so that is where we are. I have on the list to talk about today 11 books, so considering that the intro is already getting quite long because I'm probably gonna talk a lot about most of these books, and the way I chose my books for this list is quite simple. I once again had way too many favorite books this year to talk about in one video. So what last year was my most surprising books of the year is this year my favorite series. So if you thought you would see a certain book on this list and you're wondering why it's not on here, it's probably because it's gonna be in my favorite series video. And yeah, with that said, this is a list of books that are standalones, or if they're part of a series, they were the singular book I read in that series this year. So with all of that said, let's jump right into it. This video will be in order, so I will start with number 11 on my list and I will end with number 1. It was very hard for me to rank the books, and honestly I wouldn't take the ranking of these books too seriously aside from my top 2, because they could honestly change depending on my mood. But yeah, still going on with the intro, so let's just stop that finally and get into it with my number 11 spot. So for the 11th spot, I have Wait by Jeanette Winterson. This is a book that I read at the very beginning of the year. Actually, quite a few of the entries on this list are from the very beginning of this year, and actually quite a few are from the video I did where I read some of BookTuber's favorite books of 2020, so you know, they all have good taste, or I have the same taste as them. But anyway, this is a retelling of the Atlas myth, so from Greek mythology, and honestly this was a book where I read the first page and I already knew this was going to be a 5-star book. It is so gorgeously written. The themes throughout this novel are just so well woven through it. So many themes of loneliness and of responsibility. And I really was impressed by this book. The reason why it's quite low on this list is because while I did love it enough to want to put it on this list, Jeanette Winterson kind of outed herself a little bit as an asshole sometime at the beginning of the year after I read this book, because she had to go and make fun of women's fiction and complain that the covers of her oh so great literary fiction novels now look like women's fiction, which, you know, it's just not a cool thing to do. It's quite sexist. But anyway, I still sadly loved this book enough, or thought the writing of this book was gorgeous enough that I still had to put it on this list somehow. But it's the number 11 spot, so we can say it's just an honorary mention type of entry. So for my number 10 spot, I have another book that I read for my Reading Booktuber's favorite books of 2020 video. So as I said, there were a lot of good books in that video. But the book I'm talking about is White Chrysanthemum by Marilyn Bracht, which is a historical fiction novel. And in this story we follow two sisters and we follow two different timelines. First sister, the older sister we follow during the Second World War and also into the time after the Second World War. And she, at the beginning of the story, is taken by the Japanese soldiers to become a comfort woman or a comfort girl, I guess, because that's what she is at the beginning of this story. And she was taken, or she is taken, to save her little sister so the soldiers don't discover where her little sister is hiding. And so for those of you who don't know what comfort women were, first of all, the title is very misleading because there's nothing comforting about the practice of comfort women, but basically what the Japanese did during the Second World War is wherever they colonized and wherever they were, so most famously a lot of Korean women were comfort women, but also Chinese women, Vietnamese women, and so on. But wherever the Japanese were, they stole and also bought girls from families. They either brought them to Japan or they brought them to the front where the fighting was. And what these women, these girls, in many cases, as I said, had to do was basically be sex slaves for the Japanese army and provide motivation for the Japanese soldiers. So I just highly recommend is the wrong word, but if it's something that you can handle, I really would suggest you read into the history of comfort women, because it's just one of the many histories surrounding the, I don't know what to call it, but the fate of women during wars that a lot of times is brushed under the rug, that is ignored. Japan to this day has never officially acknowledged that comfort women were a thing that happened and that existed. Sometimes you can go on Twitter and you can see people like defending the Japanese and saying comfort women were never a thing, which is just blatantly not true. For over 1,000 Wednesdays, I don't remember, like I think a few years ago was the 1,000th Wednesday, but basically every week it started with comfort women, but women in Korea go to the Japanese embassy to demand justice for these women, for these girls that had to go through this horrible thing. And now there's only a handful of them left that are still alive, and so, you know, this history is dying and there still has not been justice for these women. Anyway, it's something that just, as you can tell, makes me very passionate. But so back to the plot, the older sister we follow as she's turned into a comfort woman. So because of that, there very much are trigger warnings for sexual abuse, for rape, for so many things that I cannot even remember now. So this is a very hard book to read as well. And then the second sister we follow in 2011. She has grown up. She has never talked to her family about having a younger sister. We also find out some things that happened to her during the Korean War, so we also get to see some of her history, and she basically has dealt with the guilt of feeling at fault for what happened to her older sister since 60 years ago. And yeah, it's a very heart-wrenching and just very raw story. It absolutely made me sob, and it's a hard story to read, but nevertheless at the end there is, you know, a ray of hope a little bit. And so I definitely, if it's a book that you can handle, I definitely would recommend it. There's some things that keep it for me from being perfect, just storytelling wise, but just in terms of the subject matter and in terms of the rawness of it, it's definitely a book that I recommend. Now, after spending way too long on White Chrysanthemum, let's continue on to entry number 9, which still, funnily enough, for my channel is not fantasy. I have quite a few non-fantasy books among my favorites. Who would have thought? Anyway, entry number 9 is Firekeepers Daughter by Angeline Boulley. I do not have the book here right now because guess with who it is? It is with Zilla. I lent it to her. And this is extra unusual for me for a read that I love because this is a YA thriller. As a lot of you will know, I'm not the biggest fan of YA anymore and I never read thrillers. So the fact that this made it on my list is actually quite extraordinary. Anyway, in this story we follow Danis. I sadly forgot how to pronounce her name. There was a pronunciation guide in the book. However, as I said, I don't have the book here right now. So let's keep fingers crossed that I'm pronouncing her name correctly. But we're following Danis, who is mixed heritage Ojibwe. Because of her mixed heritage, however, she does not live on reservation and she does not quite feel at home in both communities, so off reservation and on reservation. After a series of drug-related deaths happen, Danis is asked by the FBI to act as an undercover informant on the reservation. And that is basically where the story starts. Now, this book for me, on the one hand, was, well, the contents of the book on the one hand are incredibly traumatic. Once again, I can just highly suggest looking up trigger warnings if that is something that you regularly do, because there's first of all sexual assault and rape, there's drug-related trigger warnings, overdose, drug abuse, and so on. And I cannot properly remember all of the trigger warnings right now because it has been quite a few months since I read this book, so just know that there's a lot of trigger warnings and make sure to look them up first if you need them. So there is a lot of very traumatic content in this book. There's a very honest discussion about the problems that a lot of Indigenous people and a lot of Indigenous communities face in the US and also obviously outside of the US. There's a lot of very US specific legal problems that a lot of Indigenous communities face, especially when it comes to Indigenous women and the sexual assault, the rape of Indigenous women and the troubles there. So for a YA novel, this just shows that a lot of deep problems and deep-seated problems, a lot of very complex problems can be discussed in a way and realistically discussed in a way that still makes it YA friendly. Because, you know, especially when it comes to minorities and minority groups, especially when it comes to Indigenous women and Indigenous girls, a lot of them have to face those things in day-to-day lives. So it's unfair to expect these women and these girls to have to face it in day-to-day life, but then say it's not YA friendly for a book. So I do really like that those discussions are had within the book, and in a way that's both on point and very direct, but also not glorifying it. Well, glorifying is the wrong way, but not voyeuristic, because I think especially with discussions around sexual assault, there's always a danger of it becoming voyeuristic, and it's always shocking, but it doesn't need to be voyeuristic. Does it make sense? Anyway, so there's a lot of very traumatic stuff in this book that I think is very well handled and very well done. But then on the other hand, what really made me love this book is that that is not the only thing, but that this book also at the same time feels like a celebration of Indigenous life and Indigenous culture. And it's so beautiful to see how both of these things can exist side by side in a book, because both of these things exist side by side in real life. And actually Angeline Boulley in the acknowledgement wrote something, and I'm gonna try to paraphrase it, but I'm gonna be probably very bad at it because, again, I don't have the book here. It's been a while since I read the acknowledgements. But she wrote something that really made me tear up, because she very genuinely and very honestly talked about how yes, Indigenous existence is rife with trauma and with traumatic events and with traumatic history. However, Indigenous existence isn't a tragedy. It's not like there's no light whatsoever, but there's also this incredible celebration and this revival of Indigenous culture and of Indigenous ways of life, and that she didn't just want to focus on the negative parts and on the traumatic parts, but that she also wanted to showcase those lighter parts and those celebratory parts. And I think she really managed that with this book. So that is why there's no doubt that I had to put this on my list. On to entry number 8, we have one of the very few books that I read in December, and that is Dark Apprentice by Val Neal, which is the first book in the Fall of Magic series. The reason why this book is on here, which by the way I still haven't done a review for this, still coming. Also, by the way, I haven't had to mention it for any of the books that came so far, but if I have reviews for any of the books that I mention in this video, they will of course be linked down below. But anyway, the reason why this is on here is not because I think the writing style is so incredibly beautiful, because you know, the writing style is mostly just general run-of-the-mill writing style, but the reason why I think this deserves to be a spot on this list is because this is one of the most unique fantasy books that I have read this year. In this story, we follow two characters. One is Nikolai, who is a psychopathic magician, wizard. And with psychopathic, I mean, he is a psychopath. He does have, what's it called? Personality, antisocial personality disorder. So, you know, mental health rep, quite fun. Not own voices, although the author did work with both a psychologist as well as with someone who has antisocial personality disorder as sensitivity readers, and to get the rep as good as possible or as right as possible. The second character we follow is Medea, who is also a magician, a wizard, and she is autistic, and this is actually own voices rep. The author herself is autistic. Now, Nikolai is a magician, a wizard who wants to be the most powerful dark magician ever. Medea is an immortal who used to train a lot of young wizards. However, she has stopped since those young wizards have a tendency to try to kill her, and she ends up killing them. However, she does take on Nikolai as a new apprentice. So we follow the two of them basically as they go on to do their shenanigans. And this book was, as I said, so unique, so fun to read. I really loved reading from those two different neurodivergent perspectives. Medea is just a woman to my heart. I love her. She's just so cute and so adorable, and she's just a grumpy little witch, and I just love her. Nikolai was one of the most interesting characters that I have ever read about. He was sometimes unsettling, isn't the right word to be in the mind of, but you know, he frustrated me to be in the mind of sometimes, because the way he processes things just, you know, isn't how I would process things logically, obviously. So yeah, the way he processes things sometimes frustrated me, but in a good way, not in a bad way. Not in a bad way, I want to stop being in that character's mind, but in a good way. And so yes, I just really enjoyed myself reading this book, and so I just wanted to put it on this list. Entry number 7 is Honeycomb by Joanne M. Harris. This is a short story collection that is set in the same universe as Orphea, as well as kind of also in the same universe as the Loki duology, also by Joanne M. Harris, obviously. And this is a short story collection. It's a collection of modern fairy tales. And the reason why it's on here is, first of all, because Joanne M. Harris's writing is absolutely beautiful. She is someone who I usually don't call an author, I call her a storyteller, because that's what she is. She has a way of weaving together stories that's just Chef's kiss, so good. Also, this is the first book that I do have a review for on my channel. Then something else that I absolutely adored about this is that this is a short story collection, as I said, and I'm usually not the biggest fan of short story collections or short stories, novellas, because they tend to not have enough substance for me generally. However, what this collection does is, yes, it's a series of short stories, it's a series of fairy tales, which fairy tales for me are already a bit different than short stories. But this is a series of fairy tales, but they have a red thread running through them, and they are connected to each other, connected to a central narrative. Most of them at least are. And there's quite a few short stories where you're wondering how they would be connected to the central story, and then later on it suddenly all starts making sense. I don't know what else to say about this book except that Joanne Harris, again, has some of the most beautiful writing ever. She manages to make her stories feel both at the same time classic as well as modern, and just whimsical as well as incredibly, you know, heavy. Like there's a depth, there's a weight to the stories, and I love her stories, okay? What else can I say? On to the number 6 spot. I have a book by a German or German-Indian, German-Indian, I think, author. And that is Identity by Mithu Sanyal. This is kind of a type of book, if you know, for example, Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder, where you have a very central non-fiction basis for the book, but it's all woven in a story to, you know, make you digest it better. And the fictional setting for the story is we follow, what's her name? I forgot her name. We follow Nivedita, who is someone who has a blog. She is also Indian-German. I still don't know which way. She's Indian and she's German. She's of mixed heritage, let's put it like that. And she has this one professor at uni who she absolutely adores, who is called Saraswati, who everyone thinks is Indian as well, which is part of the reason why Nivedita felt so connected to this professor. And this professor is a professor for cultural studies and feminism. Now, big scandal happens. Saraswati is not Indian. She is actually white and has undergone a hormone therapy to make her skin darker and to make her appear to be Indian. So, yeah. Big scandal, as I said. And now this book follows Nivedita as she first of all tries to come to terms with that herself, but then also to come to terms with it, she confronts Saraswati with what she did. And this book basically is just a series of, first of all, the public discussions going on around this situation, but also the discussions between Nivedita and Saraswati. And I obviously just tabbed this book up because there's just so many absolutely interesting discussions had in this book, and it's just really interesting to see because a lot of the discussions in this book, I'm like, I really don't agree with this, but I also can't find obvious solutions or obvious counter arguments right now, especially to a lot of the arguments that Saraswati had, which, you know, it's just really frustrating sometimes. And a lot of times what this book does is it's not really saying that what Saraswati did is wrong or is right, but it just puts the questions out there into the world, and you kind of have to know yourself what side you're on, or if you're on no side or whatever. And yeah, I just thought this book was really interesting and just made me think a lot. It's an interesting book, and I'm sad that it's not translated, and I don't know if it's ever gonna be translated, because something that I also really appreciated about this book is because it talks about racism and, you know, oppression and bigotry, not through a US American or UK lens, which is how we mostly discuss those things, but it also discusses them through a German or Central European lens, where there's certain aspects to racism that wouldn't exist in the same way in the US. For example, in Austria, we never were an overseas colonial power. I mean, the Habsburger did have overseas colonies, like the Spanish part of the Habsburger, for example. But Austria in and of itself, during the big time of colonialism in the 18th and 19th century, Austria wasn't an overseas colonial power. However, our colonies were in Eastern Europe. And a lot of people tend to forget about those parts of the world when we talk about, you know, colonialism and context of colonialism and so on. And so we tend to forget that that is also something that to this day, you know, influences how Eastern Europeans are seen in Austria and also in Germany. So yeah, it's just seeing those discussions being had in the context of this book was just something that I very much enjoyed. Next, I have a book that I do not physically have here because once again Scylla has it, and that is The Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is a gothic romance. I really hesitate calling it a romance. It's a retelling of The Brides of Dracula, or it's a Dracula retelling following The Brides of Dracula. And basically what it is we follow our main character, whose name I have forgotten, who is seduced by Dracula and she's turned into a vampire, and she then starts following him around Europe, or Dracula takes her all around Europe, and while he does that, they get to their relationship, another woman and another man, so this is bisexual and polyamorous. But the thing is, this story is not a romance. What this story really is an account of really toxic relationship. And first of all, the thing that I didn't love the most, but I love the second most, is the writing. S.T. Gibson's writing is once again one of those books with, she has impeccable writing. I started that sentence 3 times for no reason whatsoever, but S.T. Gibson has absolutely impeccable writing. Literally the only thing about the writing, but it's not really a writing that I don't like, is this is indie published, and I'm not 100% a fan of the formatting of this book. It just kind of took me out of the story sometimes a little bit. But you know, that's not a big deal. That's literally the only negative thing I can say about this story. And so first of all, the writing is absolutely beautiful, and then just the way this toxic relationship is taken apart is just unlike anything I have ever read. It is so unique, and it's just absolutely harrowing and shocking, and just, I loved it a lot, okay? Let's put it like that. Also with the writing, once again, very unique decision. It is written as you, and the way it's written is you are Dracula. So our main character tells Dracula what he did to her, and tells Dracula their life together but through her lens. And it's just such a great tool to showcase this toxic relationship, and it's done in a way that is like, the toxic relationship is done in a way that is not romanticizing it. So I don't have that much to say about this, to be honest, because it's quite a short story as well, so I don't know what I can say without spoiling things. But it's a book where when I finished it, I was like, this is just not 5 stars. But since then, I have completely revised my opinion on this. This is full on a 5-star novel. It is absolutely genius, and if you have not picked it up yet, then please do. So I just had to change my batteries because they were empty. But now on to my number 4 spot, which is a book that I have talked about quite a bit, at least on my Twitter. And I've tried to hold back talking about it because it's a book that's not translated, that probably never will be translated, and that makes me incredibly sad. But the book is Sanguine by Anna Zabini. Also, I am sorry, I did an interview with Anna Zabini. I still have not finished translating it because it's been a lot of work, okay? I think I already put in like 5 hours or something, and I'm not even halfway through it yet, so yeah, it's a whole thing. Anyway, this book is a book that is set in a dystopian Vienna where there exist demons. And because of the existence of demons, there's this kind of organization that has arisen that is called the Auserwählten, or the Chosen Ones. And this organization is a surveillance organization. It's kind of a little bit of a fascistic organization. And we follow people in this organization, basically, and we follow their lives. It's kind of hard to explain what this book is about because there's not that much of a plot. I mean, there is a plot, but you know, it's not a traditional 3-act, 5-act structured plot. It's a plot that is told not chronologically. It's a plot where it's not like a lot of dystopian stories where we're fighting against this big organization or where we're fighting against the state or whatever, but it's a dystopian where we basically just follow the single characters and their very personal struggles, both, you know, as themselves with the situation, but also with and against the organization. And so, yeah, it's just a really hard book to sum up. Also, I did do a video with Scylla where we went to all the different places that appear in the book. So I will leave that video linked down below and up there. But anyway, the reason why I love this book is, first of all, once again, because it is absolutely gorgeously unique. I have never read a book like this. It's just, you know, there were some things that maybe didn't work perfectly for me in terms of how the plot and the story was structured, but I'm just someone, I love when an author does something that is different, that is challenging, and that maybe isn't perfect for me, but where I can just see the author made a decision and they followed through with that decision. And that is definitely the case with this book. Also, I'm not just a little disclaimer, I already loved this book before I met Anna Zabini, and it's just an add-on that Anna Zabini is an absolutely amazing human being. Like, she's so nice. So after my battery being empty, now my SD card was full. Who'd have thought? Anyway, I was just gushing about Anna Zabini, wasn't I? She's an amazing human being. And then aside from that, this book is just, as I said, first of all, the structure I just love. Second of all, the writing, once again, is beautiful. I am someone, 90% of the time, am not the biggest fan of German writing. I think a lot of times, especially with fantasy, it can sound quite clunky, and you know, I'm not the biggest fan always of the German language. However, when German writing is done well, there are few things that can compare to it for me, and this book is German writing done well. And not just because a lot of times it uses Austrian German instead of German German, which, you know, is appreciated very, very much, especially since I know that the publishing industry is very Germany focused. And the last thing is the characters were... I love all of the characters. They have such depth to them, and they go through harrowing things, and they are just laid bare to you, and I just... What can I say? I loved everything about this book. I loved every single thing about this book. My number 3 spot, once again, I don't have here, but not because I lent it out, but because I myself borrowed the book from a friend, which I regret deeply because I want my copy of the book. Maybe I'm gonna buy it with like my Christmas money or something, because I probably should, shouldn't I? But that book was The Chosen and the Beautiful by Ni Vo. This is a retelling of The Great Gatsby, which by the way I haven't read, and it is following, I believe her name was Jordan, so Nick Carraway's girlfriend is the character that we follow. And I don't remember if she probably wasn't in the original version, right? But in this version, in any case, she is Asian American and she's also bisexual. So that is the basic gist of the story, and also there's some magical elements in the story that I just thought added a lot to the story. But anyway, my thoughts on this. First of all, once again, beautiful writing. I have read all of Ni Vo's books this year, so I started reading Ni Vo this year. I have read her 2 novellas, and I have also read this one, which is her first full-length novel. And Ni Vo's writing is just gorgeous, beautiful, next level. Like, I am not someone who has a particular love or a particular hate for sex scenes. I'm usually like, you know, I have the utilitarian approach to smut and sex scenes in books. That is what I'm saying. And I usually like them if they add something to the story or add something to the characters. And I'm like, whatever, take them, leave them, if that's not the case. The sex scene in this book is like not just the most beautifully written sex scene that I have ever read. It is one of the most beautifully written scenes that I have ever read, period. Like, the emotions that I got from reading that scene were it seared into my brain still months after reading it. I cannot really say that I loved or didn't love the characters, because you know, I loved them because of the writing. For me, the writing in this story and the way the story is told was the central part of the story. And I remember after reading it, I had some really profound thoughts, but I cannot for the life of me remember what they were. I'm gonna look right now through my voice messages with my friend to see if I can find them, because I need to share it. I don't even remember when I read it. I think I read it in July. Okay, so I have found my thoughts that I had when I was done with the book. The first thing was that I wrote was the last page was one of the most beautiful I have ever read. So once again, just read it for the writing. I am serious. But also I somehow wrote, I'm depressed, but in a fainting Victorian lady sitting on a windowsill type of way. I don't know how else to put it. Like, some books make me depressed, and others are the sighing type depressing. So, yeah. If you want to know what that book made me feel like, that's what it made me feel like. And the thoughts that I had that I actually wanted to share is that I really loved how the main character was woven into the telling of the story, because the main character is mostly the one through which the story is told. I don't remember if it was in first person or third person though. And throughout most of the story, she's taking a very passive role in the story. And it feels like she's more just a watcher of everything. I tried pronouncing voyeur, but I don't know how to do it right now. I cannot switch between 2 languages. It's literally impossible for me. So it feels like she's more just a spectator, that was the word I was looking for, of the entire story, until the very end when she starts taking a more active role also in her own story. And I just really loved that development throughout the book, and I thought it was really, really well done. So yes, anyway, that was what I wanted to say about this book. So now let's move on to my top two. So the top 2 books I have on this list are not ranked because honestly, I couldn't do it if you put a gun to my head. I gotta be very honest. Throughout most of the year, I said one of these two books is my favorite book of the year, and I read both of them for the first time at around the same time. So back then, that one book was my favorite book of the year and throughout most of the year. However, the other book I have read recently or reread recently, and I would now put it as my favorite book of the year, but I don't know if that is recency bias or not. So, you know, I'm just gonna talk about both of them right now, and they have both collectively the number 1 and 2 spot. First, I of course have The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wang. A book that feels like I have read it so long ago that I always forget that I read it in 2021. I always think I read it before that. And this is a standalone high fantasy set in a world that is inspired by Eastern Asia, more specifically Japan, or feudal Japan. Although there's parts of this world that are very technologically advanced, but the part of the world that most of this is set in is very much inspired by feudal and samurai, I guess, Japan. So in this story we follow two main characters. We follow Misaki and Mamoru. Misaki is a middle-aged woman. She's probably like in her mid-30s, I would guess, and 30s, and Mamoru is her son, who is a bit of a prodigy because of the family that he belongs to, because this family is kind of a bit the ruling family of the village that they're in. And so you mostly follow the two of them. Misaki is a woman who has some secrets in her past, and Mamoru is just growing up, learning to deal with, you know, being part of this really important family. And one day he gets a new classmate who tells him that the things that he believes in terms of history, in terms of even just the current times, might not all be true the way Mamoru learned about them. And so yes, that is the basic starting point of the story. Once again, part of the reason why I absolutely love this is because I think the story structure of this book is really, really unique. You can tell that if a book has something unique to give to me, then I'm already just like, I love it so much. But the reason why I think this is very interesting is because what would most usually be the climax of most fantasy novels, both standalones as well as series, what would most usually be the climax is around the halfway point, maybe the 2/3 point of this book. And then everything afterwards, including the climax of this book, is stuff that we wouldn't typically get in a fantasy story. I'm trying to keep this as like vague as possible for spoiler reasons, but I just love the way this story was structured. The only negative thing is that the last chapter is quite long, and the last chapter is more something that is a time, because this is set in a world where the author already wrote a YA duology, and so the last chapter doesn't really have anything to do with this story anymore, but it's more a tie-in to that other series. So that's the only negative thing, but otherwise I absolutely love this structure. And obviously, if you have heard anything about this book, you will know that this book is a book that will make you cry. Will make you cry like a little baby, and it did that same thing with me. I like all of this, maybe more, just made me sob so much. I don't think I have ever cried that much. I woke up with a headache the next day because I cried that much. So yeah, it's just a very, very emotional book, and it's one of the few books that, you know, I have heard about on BookTube, I have heard about on Book Twitter, I have heard about from friends in the online spaces, and that has been hyped to high heavens. And usually I'm very, very hesitant when going into books that are very hyped, because you know, the way we hype books on BookTube and on Book Twitter, no book can hold up to those expectations. Like, that's how much hype we have. However, for me personally, this book surpassed the hype that I have seen around it. And yeah, it's just, I gotta reread. Talking about it now, it's been a year, I gotta reread. It is what it is. And then the last book I want to talk about is a book that, if you follow me on BookTube or Book Twitter or any bookish platforms in the past few months, I'm sure you have already been waiting for me to mention this book. And that is The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. This almost, but not quite, made it onto my favorite series of the year list, but sadly or luckily, depending on how you look at it, because now I could start the year with an amazing book, but sadly the second book only came in January. Like, I only got it in January instead of December, and I didn't want to put this on my favorite series list while just having read the first book. Anyway, this book is the first book in the Rook and Rose series by M.A. Carrick, who is an author duo consisting of Alec Helms and Marie Brennan. And this series is an adult high fantasy series, and we follow Ren, who is a con artist, and she has returned to the city of her birth to pull off her biggest con yet, which is to make her way into one of the noble families and to hopefully then never have to worry about money ever again. That is the story of our main character, or one of our central main character in the first book. And aside from that, we also follow a masked vigilante. Well, we don't follow him. He exists in the city. We follow a ruthless crime boss, we follow politics, we follow nobles, we follow intrigues. There's a lot of magic happening in this world. There's a mystery about children who have been kidnapped, and once they return they can't sleep anymore and then die, sadly. So yeah, there's a lot of elements to the story, all of them amazing, and I reread this in December. It was, well, not in December, I think I read it in November. It was even better on reread. Like, let me just mention all the elements that are amazing about this. First of all, the world building. Queer normative world building, check. Attention to detail, check. Absolutely gorgeous and vibrant, check. Different cultures, different people with different conflicts and different magic systems, check. Then, moving on to the characters. The characters are so well written, and you really understand their motivations and where they come from. There's also characters with a lot of mystery surrounding them, where you don't really know, are they good guys, are they bad guys, like on which side of the moral spectrum do they fall. We know they're morally grey, but are they like a blackish gray, or are they like more on the lighter gray side? Then the writing I also absolutely love. Marie Brennan and Alec Helms do something with language that I just really love. I actually didn't notice it as much in the first book, but in the second book I really noticed it, where they have different characters speaking different languages, and they don't have to constantly mention X said this in this and this language, or Y switched to this and this language. No, the way they do it is they subtly change sentence structure, subtly change where the verb goes, for example. And through that, you are instantly clued in which language is spoken, which is just so amazing. I'm like, oh my god, I love this book and this series so much, and I'm like, this is why I'm saying I don't know which of those two is my favorite, because I also just finished the second book in this series, and I legitimately, I think this is my favorite series of all time now. There, I said it. It's so good. Also, my battery is once again blinking because apparently the one that I put in wasn't fully loaded. So, that's a good excuse to have to wrap this up now and to not just completely go off. Also, I do have a full review on this, so go and check it out. But anyway, I absolutely love this book. The only negative that I could say is that it's quite a slow start, so you're introduced to all the different pieces of the story one by one, and it can take some time, especially since there are a lot of names when it comes to the nobles and so on in the city and with the politics. However, there is a glossary, so that helps. But yeah, just be aware that it's a slow start into the story, but I promise you, like, once the first third or something is over, you will have fallen in love with all of the characters. And yeah, that was it for my favorite books of 2021. Tell me in the comments down below if you have read any of these books, what were your thoughts on them. Also tell me in the comments down below what were your favorite books of 2021. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, will read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will be left linked down below, so go and check those out as well, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!